Hi, I'm James Fordeer, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences Bioscience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. For today's episode, I'm joined by Aspen Ellis, PhD candidate at University of California, Santa Cruz, who joined me to talk about the largest academic strike in history and also a recent bioscience article on the topic. As always, please take a moment to rate and like this episode, and let's go to the interview. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Hey, great to be here.
Okay, so we're going to be talking a lot about a strike today, but I thought to get us started, it might be interesting to chat a little bit about the conditions, financially and otherwise, that are faced by graduate students these days, whether within the UC system or more broadly. What's kind of that experience like for, those doing that work?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think a kind of important framing that I think about is that I think graduate school, especially in life sciences, is a really critical step in a lot of career paths. Most programs or most career fields that have long-term job security require a graduate degree at this point of some sort, be it master's or PhD. And so I think for that reason, like getting accepted into a PhD program or a master's program can feel like an immense privilege. But it's also a pretty intense decision to sign up for that amount of time, typically enduring financial instability and hardship. And that's something that I think a lot of folks are aware of as they're signing on for a graduate program. The poor grad student trope is certainly no joke. The vast majority of life sciences graduate students, about 94%, don't provide a stipend that constitutes a living wage. And so if you're certainly in this period of life where you're thinking about starting families, settling down, beginning your career, and you're thinking about signing on for up to 8 years in some cases of really low income and general job precarity, that can be a pretty big decision to take on.
Yeah, and it's always struck me that that's, a potential source of difficulty when you're trying to do things like, expand the diversity and the inclusion of a graduate program. You're essentially making it rather difficult for those who don't have, some sort of external source of wealth almost.
Exactly that, yeah. And I think as we're thinking about exactly diversifying the graduate student body, the needs for support of those more diverse students are increasing too. And currently, we're just not seeing that necessarily keep up in the institutions in the way that we need them to. If you're talking about bringing in international students who have different financial needs, if you're talking about supporting graduate student families and parents or folks from working class or low income backgrounds, that's a much harder decision for those individuals typically, and it's a much more precarious life period for those individuals to go through graduate school.
So one of the points that I think the article captures really well is the ways in which, some of those effects might be more acute for those who have excluded identities. And I was hoping you could just chat a little bit about that and kind of give us some context for the way that played into the situation.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's important to recognize that, like we've been talking about, financial precarity is one of those ways for sure. So financial precarity obviously disproportionately impacts graduate students from working class backgrounds, and especially in fields like the life sciences, where a lot of graduate school applications rely on your previous experience. And a lot of that can be based on things like unpaid internships during undergraduate school or after, in the interim between undergrad and applying to graduate school. Those that have fewer financial resources or who have to support themselves or family exclusively are going to be less able to take those positions that are unpaid or low paid, and frequently require a lot of moving and instability in that period of time. And that may make them less competitive as applicants to graduate programs. So already we've got a barrier there to begin with. But beyond that, we also know that studies have shown that people of color with undergraduate debt are about 50% less likely to enroll in graduate programs than similarly indebted white students. And once in programs, Black PhD students are a lot more likely to accrue debt. And women as well, we know, are a lot more likely to accrue debt and typically accrue more debt in graduate programs than men do. And then there's also the case, like beyond that financial aspect of the power dynamics that are present in graduate programs. So because we've got this structure where graduate students typically heavily rely on PIs and faculty members for access to career resources and mentorship and support during graduate programs, there is that really extreme power dynamic that can frequently be abused, especially as student bodies become more diverse and support needs become more diverse. So we know that those power dynamics where graduate students are reliant on faculty can make graduate programs really fertile grounds for harassment and bullying. And things like persistent microaggressions, appropriation of credit, or like gender-based harassment can come up again and again in these programs, with about 84% of STEM graduate students, based on global studies, experiencing workplace bullying from their supervisors. And of course, that can really affect mental health, but it can also have major financial consequences like loss of fellowships or teaching assistantships if that interpersonal dynamic becomes really severe. We know that within ecology, folks are a lot more likely to experience hostile work environments if they do have these excluded identities. And so, especially when we're talking about our scientific fieldwork, which often involves things like isolation in small teams and being remote in the field with these coworkers, we could have these really elevated risks of identity-based harassment and assault.
Okay, and so one thing I'm curious about, and we'll get into some of the nittier and grittier aspects of the strike later on, but just in terms of those bullying harassment elements, what ways can a strike be a way of addressing that?
Yeah. And I think a lot of what we hear when we're having these conversations within departments is that there are a lot of independent departmental initiatives, especially in institutions like we have here in California, to try and improve those working conditions for folks with excluded identities at that departmental level. And those are excellent. It can be things like food pantries that can be supported by coworkers to help bridge the gaps between financial need, et cetera. But a lot of the barriers that we're talking about here also require institutional change for those protections to really make a difference for the inclusion and protection for those students. And organized labor historically, beyond the academic space, has been a really powerful tool to make that systematic change, but the same is certainly true in academic environments. Historically, for example, the University of Michigan graduate workers were the first to have a union that organized around a contract that expanded healthcare protections for gender-affirming care for trans graduate workers, for example. So actually making the moves to get that institutionally put into place where that's a contractually protected right for students can really protect against the individual shifts that can happen as department culture change with faculty coming and going, et cetera, where that protection can carry over and there can be a lot more trust that you will be able to have recourse, for example, if you do end up in a situation where you're experiencing workplace bullying or harassment from a PI. Things like third-party arbitration in harassment and bullying cases, for example, can be contractually protected by union strikes and contracts to be able to make sure that those students actually do have recourse if they end up in one of these situations.
So in a sense, it gives you a mechanism to ensure that the policy is within the institution and not at the whim of an individual department head, and you're no longer reliant necessarily on personnel who are well-meaning to get something done in an appropriate way. You actually have it built into the full system.
Exactly that, yeah. And those really complement each other well, where you could have these good actors that can really make a difference for department culture, but having those protections in place, especially when it comes to those financial measures, like actual baseline wage amounts, for example, are really essential to work in tandem with those departmental initiatives.
And I think the fact that you mentioned wages there gives us a good opportunity to talk about another role of graduate students, which is that of workers. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about, the ways in which graduate students are workers as well as, of course, being students, and, how those kind of roles have an interplay within the broader setting.
Yeah, it's complex and it varies a little bit by institution and program, certainly. So I think that's another thing when we're talking about organizing later that comes up is that the experience of being a graduate student does vary a lot depending on what program you enter and what department you're in. But typically it's the case that as a graduate student, especially in life sciences, you're working, and that's typically capped at 50% time under the understanding that you're also a student for 50% of your time. And you might be working on PA-ships, so you might be assisting with classes or teaching your own classes, and that could be where your funding comes from. Or you could be paid through a grant from an advisor or PI to complete research for their projects or for your own projects. Or ideally, in this sort of dream scenario, you've received some funding directly on your own research via a fellowship or other. But you're very much there providing a role for the university in some capacity. You're working for the university either to provide educational support to undergraduates or doing research for that institution. And that labor is very much intermingled with the role of the traineeship that comes with graduate school. But you are very much also providing a service for the institution. And in that sense, you are very much a worker.
And let's talk for a moment about the role of unions in all of this. I think most of us are familiar with the notion of a student union, but I've never particularly known what one actually did. And nor did I know that an organization like the United Auto Workers would be implicated in this sort of setting. So, kind of how does that play into the overall picture?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it's a shifting question. We've seen a really strong increase in unionization in the last even 3 years. Graduate student unions aren't new by any means, but I think they are pretty quickly on the rise. I think in large part in response to the growing needs of graduate student bodies and the delay in institutional capacity to catch up to that. Um, Graduate students have been at some institutions unionized for quite some time. At the UC system, especially the teaching graduate workers, so those who were on TA ships or GSI ships, for example, where they're teaching classes, have been unionized for years. But it is certainly the case that I think at private institutions, that's a newer conversation. Public universities, unions have been a little bit more common historically. That said, I think your question about the United Auto Workers being involved is an interesting one. Typically, it's the case that these are quite small working populations, and therefore a union just can't necessarily independently support workers if they're only within that working body. So a lot of the time, a graduate student group will become a chapter of a larger national union. So the graduate students at University of California, Santa Cruz are unionized under United Auto Workers 4811, I believe. All currently graduate students are on that same union now. So in the last few years, researchers and fellows have also joined teaching staff. And currently all graduate students can be unionized if they are working for the university.
And what sort of terms are, arranged by the union? And I think, for me personally, I'm familiar with, unions in a setting in which, there's a 5 or 10 year contract with, set levels of pay. We're talking about, workers who are doing, a given job. And when that contract comes up for negotiation, that's when you typically have, things like a strike if it were necessary. But how is that different or similar in the graduate school setting?
It was certainly similar. I think that in some cases contracts are a bit shorter. Currently, as we're trying to negotiate for sort of rapidly changing graduate student needs in really expensive housing markets, especially in California. We're just seeing a lot of tension between graduate workers and institutions in terms of trying to fight for improved working conditions. So same structure, though. It's the idea that the graduate union supports its workers. The important issues to those graduate workers get raised through a number of different organizing events leading up to a contract negotiation. And then there's some kind of contract negotiating team that represents the workers of the union in a series of negotiations with the university trying to get this new contract for the next period, however long that lasts. And the conditions that are in there would vary depending on the issues that are important to that graduate worker body. But they're typically things like fair pay, childcare subsidies, anti-bullying and harassment protections, for example, waived fees for international students, all things that increase support for graduate workers typically or protect against harassment and bullying.
Okay, let's now talk about some of the history that's described in the article. What happened in 2022?
Yeah, great question. So 2022 was an interesting year to be a graduate student at the University of California. I'm in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology department here, and was the union steward for my department leading up to 2022. And we had a series of unproductive contract negotiations where it dragged on for months and months. There weren't a lot of moves on either side. And over a series of unfair labor practices that were conducted by the university, the union voted to go on strike in response to those unfair labor practices during the negotiations period. And it was organized across UC campuses, so all campuses throughout the state, that postdoctoral scholars, graduate student workers, and then also academic researchers all unilaterally went on strike in what was the largest academic strike in U.S. history. I believe it was 48,000 individuals on strike at one time. So that strike lasted, I believe, about a month and ended with a contract around Christmas in 2022. So a lot of those wins, I think, have pushed contract negotiation, or they've pushed working conditions towards a point that has really improved beyond what they were before. There definitely is still a significant gap between working conditions and what would be necessary to achieve, for example, a fair living wage in a lot of the locations where UC campuses are, especially in Santa Cruz, which is currently, I believe, rated the most expensive rental market in the US.
And yeah, it sounds like it would be incredibly difficult to, get a stipend, for instance, that would actually support someone who is trying to, kind of live at any sort of, you know, if not comfortable, even sort of sustainable level.
Yeah, especially given that we're paid on 50% time, getting a stipend that supports that is difficult in a really expensive rental market. And I think that that's one of the reasons that these strikes in California gain so much attention is that the gap between what would be comfortable living and working conditions and what the reality is for many students is so great that the strikes typically are more frequent and more involved.
What are some of the challenges that are faced in an academic environment, versus what some might imagine as a more traditional labor environment? I imagine that it's a little bit different to be, sort of enrolled as a student at, the institution at which one is going to strike.
Yeah, it's complicated from an organizing standpoint for sure. So my role as a union steward is mostly to act as a liaison between union updates and the graduate student body, and then to bring graduate student concerns back to the union to represent what's happening in our department. Um, and certainly being in that role leading up to the strike, I was aware of a lot of considerations that just aren't really addressed under traditional, we call it like shop floor organizing strategies. So any kind of union organizing that is typically from more traditional work contexts doesn't necessarily apply as well, I think, to the academic environment. And I think that there's a few reasons for that. One being that the nature of work in an academic environment between graduate students is so diverse, even within a life sciences department. The experience of being a assistant to a professor teaching a class, for example, is very different than the experience of somebody who's actively overseas doing field work during a strike, for example. They're certainly still working for the university, but if they're creating their own plans, they're doing their own research, they're on their own funding, it's tricky to identify how labor could effectively be withheld in those cases. And also, it's just tricky to create, I think, a unified graduate student movement when you've got such diverse experiences of those workers. So that was one of the main considerations is how you can create any kind of unified front when you've got so much going on and so many differences between the experiences of graduate workers. I think another is that shared role of trainee and worker and the difficulty there. I think that a lot of folks really appreciate about academic environments that there is this cross-career stage collaboration that comes from that environment. So the role of a PI is not just a boss, it's also a mentor, and it's in many cases one of your main supports as you're moving on to a next career, right? And so withholding labor from the university in many cases also can create tension in terms of individual relationships within the department, in terms of folks you're collaborating with or working for. So if you're on an advisor's grant and you're withholding labor from the university, that also in some cases looks and feels like withholding labor from your supervisor. And that can create strains on those relationships. And I think that those relationships are really valuable to a lot of people in these departments. So that interpersonal stuff needs to be organized around.
Yeah, that sounds like it would be immensely challenging, especially in an industry or a field in which your relationships are going to be so important for the rest of your career. It's going to matter, say 10 years down the road or something like that.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that it's certainly one of the main challenges that was felt by graduate students, and also one of the main issues that faculty had as they were trying to figure out how they could support the movement or how they could interact with their students and the students generally in the department during the movement. I think that one really important organizing consideration, and something we talk a lot about in the paper, is that a lot of, especially life sciences departments in University of California, and I think generally, there's a very shared goal of trying to address shared diversity issues within departments and trying to build towards a more diverse future for our field. And thinking about interventions that you can have in graduate programs to make that student retention and experience more supportive towards a more diverse student body. And I think that that shared organizing goal of we're trying to make the field more inclusive for future generations of scientists is a really key shared value between a lot of faculty and a lot of students. So that was more effective typically than a lot of other messaging as we were talking in trying to support students and talking with their faculty during the movement, that there is sort of this shared vision of what the strike is for, even though the current experience of being on strike can be a really challenging interpersonal period to work through.
And, how does on a practical level that sort of coalition building actually work? What's the model for having those discussions? Where do they take place? Is this stuff that happens, in a Discord channel or a Slack room? Is it email? What are the mechanisms? How does one how did you accomplish, this stuff?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it probably varies a lot on local union contexts. For us, there's a lot of communication between graduate students already. So within our department, graduate students are all a pretty tight-knit group. Here at UC Santa Cruz, we've got about 80 or 90 in our department, and we're all in touch already on things like WhatsApp groups and channels. So a lot of that organizing we would do leading up to movements like these in terms of like what issues are important to EEB graduate students and what concerns are leading up to the strike, what kind of information people needed. That would be hosted typically via me, like relaying that information via these text channels, or frequently holding a lot of town halls so that we could talk as groups about what our concerns were, what our values were leading up to these movements. I think that an important organizing challenge that we realized that we really needed to be doing a good job of addressing during this movement, and I think we talk a lot about in the paper as a recommendation for other departments going through movements like these, is that organizing and coalition building can't actually just stop at the graduate student level. When you do have these really cross-stage relationships within departments, and a lot of these, like, for example, the shared value between graduate students and PIs of maintaining a high quality of undergraduate education, it's really important to think about doing that coalition building stages. That can look like having a department steward or another union liaison from another department go to faculty meetings leading up to these movements or during these movements to talk about sort of practically what the movement would look like, what legally faculty and supervisors can and can't do to support their students during those movements. Just general Q&A, I think, can assuage a lot of the kind of fears and anxieties leading up to strikes. But also, I think just making sure that it's clear that the intent is to build coalitions of support around these movements and not to have this distinct conflict between stages is important.
I'm wondering about what types of labor are withheld in this situation and what types of labor are not withheld. What work continues to go on and what grinds to a halt? Are undergraduate students, still in classrooms? What kind of things happen?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think that that's a lot of the organizing work that needs to be done leading up to a movement. And I think that in order to make a movement effective, there needs to be pretty clear consensus on what that should look like for any given institution. And I think that there probably will be some variation between institutions. So I can tell you a lot of the conversations that we had.
Sure. What works best?
The most clear-cut labor that can be withheld is typically teaching labor. So a teaching assistant that's on strike would not be going to class. They would not be holding sections. They would not be responding to student emails about classroom questions or class questions. They would not be doing any of the labor that they would typically be doing it underpaid, or if they were paid to do that role, right? So grading, teaching, essentially. That's reasonably clear cut. Much of the time, in order to maintain support for those undergraduate students, students would individually choose to sort of reach out and share resources with their students leading up to and during those movements about sort of what students can expect during a strike in terms of what their education would look like, deadlines for grading, et cetera, and what will happen in those different cases. So to maintain communication, a lot of students would still be talking to their undergraduates, but in terms of doing their labor as an instructor, that was off the table. I think that it gets more complicated when it comes to research labor. And this is something that I think departments, especially life sciences departments, need to do a lot of thinking around. It's reasonably new for research graduate students to be unionized alongside teaching assistants. I think the UC strike was the first time that that's happened in the US. And currently, researchers being unionized at our university is new since when I started graduate school in 2021. So this is the first time we're trying to actually address those issues. And I think as that becomes more common around the country, hopefully that will become a bigger conversation and people will understand more and more organizing considerations leading up to movements to do that well. Currently, we basically would try to identify flow charts of the sorts of work that could be effectively withheld or couldn't be. Typically, it's any kind of labor that is supporting directly a thesis gets a little bit complicated, especially things like time-sensitive field work or lab work for folks who are taking care of live animals, for example, in labs. That can be harder to effectively withhold or impossible in some cases. So there would be sort of these conversations about where labor could be withheld effectively to put pressure on the university without just completely backfiring on your own thesis or your relationships with your advisors.
That's interesting. And, how did this situation ultimately resolve? What were the, outcomes? Was it a new agreement? What sort of victories were won? What kind of happened? How did it all shake out?
Yeah. Over the course of negotiations during the strike, the university, I think, put out several additional orders. One was eventually voted yes by the majority of graduate workers across the UC system. The tricky thing about our local university context is that the UC system organizes as a unit, but the experiences and concerns of graduate students vary a good deal between campuses. So, for example, the experience of being a student at UC Berkeley is quite different from the experience of being a student at UC Santa Cruz, just in terms of the sort of support you have from the institution and the sort of like local concerns that you're dealing with in terms of financial needs, for example. And that means that as everybody is going to vote on what kind of contract should be accepted, there's going to be some campuses that are a lot more satisfied by that contract than others. And in our case, University of California, Santa Cruz was still pretty frustrated by sort of the level of conditions that were won in this contract. They definitely don't address a lot of the worker concerns on our campus and on several other campuses as well, especially those with, again, higher cost of living. But it is certainly true that the strike itself pushed those conditions way farther towards that baseline than we could have done without that major scale organizing. And that those raises have been really meaningful for a lot of graduate workers, including the sort of support that was run just on general conditions.
So, some concessions were gained, but there's, still yet work to be done. And of course, challenges still remain for, future negotiations.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that that's the experience of being on strike is certainly a stressful and sort of emotional period for a lot of graduate students. So it certainly feels like once you've organized for one, the more you can get out of doing that organizing work and putting in that effort to make sure that those conditions are one to the maximum extent possible, just feels like it removes pressure of needing to organize as quickly again in the future, especially as like cost of living continues to raise and conditions continue to get harder for graduate students as sort of needs of those graduate student workers increase.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm wondering, what occasioned the article? I do work at the Journal, so I should ask questions like that. What was the motivation for, getting the word out in this sort of, setting, in this sort of format?
Yeah, so this paper started as an idea within my lab group. Historically, folks in my lab have been pretty engaged with the union because we have pretty shared goals of working on improving access to the field of conservation and the field of ecology and evolutionary biology. And so I think a lot of students in my lab group historically have been reasonably involved with union efforts because that's a really immediate way to improve support for diverse students. So we were reflecting on the experience of being on strike, especially on this sort of contrasting value and experience, right, of having the shared goal of improving diversity within EEB fields and life sciences fields generally between different career stages. That's like a shared goal of undergraduates, faculty, graduate workers, et cetera. But then the experience of being on strike is that there's a lot of sort of conflict between those levels, especially as you're experiencing those immediate interpersonal challenges of withholding labor from a supervisor, for example. And it felt like there was a need to increase capacity within departments to have conversations about those shared goals leading up to enduring movements. And our experience of being graduate workers is that a really great way to do that is to put these conversations into the literature. And that just gives folks a kind of neutral tool as they're having those conversations to point to of, look, here are a lot of those concerns that come up from another institution. What if we had a conversation within our department, ideally institutions across the country, to sort of talk about some of these issues and these shared values in advance so that you're not engaging in all of those immediate organizing concerns as you're going through the movement for the first time. It certainly felt to us like a movement of this scale that's like pretty historical in its impact. There were a lot of lessons learned there, and that going through some kind of effort to put those into writing so that we could share those between universities would be helpful.
Okay, now putting together this paper, I noted that it was, a large authorship. You've got 43 people on it. How did that kind of come together?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was important for us to sort of take a labor movement approach to writing this paper, right? In that there's so much like cross-stage collaboration and support in numbers for these sorts of movements, and that's how they get going. An issue like this, which can be sort of politically fraught in departments, it was really important to us to show that there is this huge body of support for having these conversations. So initially, we started by doing that by doing a snowball method of involving graduate students within our department, and then also within the union and other departments, in some cases around other UC campuses, to be able to identify what these kind of shared concerns were during the strike, the challenges we experienced, the organizing concerns we had to navigate. We also ended up polling our department broadly to receive feedback that we were maybe missing from that co-author group. So we were asking folks about what their experience of being on strike was, what they felt the main challenges were that weren't addressed, for example, so that we could pull that feedback more broadly. And we did that across career stages. So we were asking graduate students, undergraduates, postdocs, academic researchers, and lab techs, and then faculty as well. So we were mostly starting with that sort of core group of graduate students writing the paper. And we felt it was really important to reflect the graduate student experience as sort of the main goal of this paper. But we also recognize that as we're talking about cross-stage coalition building, it's also really important to have those perspectives from other career stages represented on the paper as well. So we later engaged postdocs, undergraduates, and academic researchers and faculty on the paper as well, so that we could make sure that as we're writing the piece and making sure that those pieces are represented, that the experiences we're putting down are actually reflective of those of being in those different career stages in a department during the strike.
Absolutely. And I think none of this will be things that you haven't mentioned already, but for the purpose of summation, for those who are considering embarking on a similar pathway, what are the lessons learned? What are the messages that you think could be the most valuable for those who may be considering doing something of the sort that you did with this strike?
Yeah, I think that my main piece of advice is to do your best to build just like coalitions and social networks within your department as a baseline, right? And I think that a lot of that is around identifying what the values of individuals in your departments are, what people care about, and what they're willing to like support and stand for. And that when there are those shared values between career stages, that those are really like clearly communicated, especially leading up to movements like strikes that can be so divisive. So I think any conversations that can be had openly across career stages about the shared values of supporting graduate students, improving the future of the field, et cetera, can help make those shared goals easier to remember as you're then navigating what can be pretty difficult interpersonal conversations, especially as organizing gets more complex, as we do more and more strikes at universities where these organizing challenges are still very much being worked out. I think that the more sharing of those ideas in group conversations that you can do is essential.
Thank you very much. It's been an incredibly fascinating story to hear, and I'm very grateful for your time and sharing it with me and with our listeners, of course. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much.
And that concludes this episode of Bioscience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal Bioscience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.